продолжаем серию наших интервью. Наш второй гость из трех Питер Франкопан, историк, человек, который преподает в Оксфорде и сейчас получил приглашение еще, ну, как минимум в один университет, насколько я знаю. Это человек, который очень хорошо знает историю Шелкового пути, и, собственно, про Шелковый путь его ключевая работа, которая стала бестселлером, «Шелковый путь. Новая история мира». Мы поговорим с ним в том числе об истории нашего региона, поговорим о Китае, о том, чего нам ждать о Китае. So we will talk about your area of interests, I believe, about Silk Road, about this region. You are one of the just few researchers who know history of this region and based your academic work on that. And first, my question is why you are interested in Silk Road, and why do you believe that not new history but history of the world was started here or something? If we can talk like that.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to come and talk. Well, there's the sort of the short answer, I suppose, is that when I was young, I fell in love with Russia, actually, and Russian history. And I was very lucky. I studied Russian at school and at university. And in my last year at Cambridge, I studied a paper that looked at the interactions between early Russia, Kiev and Rus, with Constantinople and Baghdad. And it introduced me to a world that I'd learned nothing about at school. I had never heard about the importance of Central Asia. I never heard the word Silk Roads. I never heard about China being important. Everything that I read in the newspapers, everything that I was taught about in school was always about Western Europe. And I'm a child of the Cold War. When I grew up, everything in Western Europe was about freedom. Everything else in other parts of the world was about lack of freedom and problems. And in fact, even when I had a map, I start my book, I had a map on my wall when I was a boy. And it seemed to me that the world is quite a big place. And that if you study only the history of yourself, and your own immediate surroundings, then you miss out on understanding the world properly. So the truth is that the Silk Roads themselves and these connections evolved into much later into my research. But as a boy, I think it was just realizing that the world that I was being taught about didn't reflect the reality. When I switched on, when I did watch the news, I saw SS-20 missiles being deployed in eastern Germany. I saw things going on in China. I saw war in Cambodia. I saw revolution in Iran. And the history I was being taught at school and I read about taught me nothing about these places.
And why do you think this region is important for the world now?
Well, I think it's important now, and the same reason it's been important since the beginning of time. Okay. I mean, the first ever cities in human history were created in what's now Iraq, in Mesopotamia. The first ever laws that were ever written in the same place. The Garden of Eden was thought to be there too. And all of our global religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, have all been brought by travelers, by merchants, by explorers, by holy people, along the big trade routes that have connected ultimately North Africa and Western Europe right the way through this part of the world, the center of Asia, and through to China. And it's true, 2,500 years ago, news and goods didn't travel so fast like they do today. But our ancestors have always been interested in fashion. They've always been interested in expensive items that are rare. They've always been interested in technology. They've always been interested in fact, about learning about other people on the other side of the world, both for reasons of curiosity, because we as a species, we're curious. We're interested in ideas as human beings. I have a dog. He's not interested in anything apart from eating. And but I think this exchange of knowledge has been something that defines us as an animal. And there's no difference to that thousands of years ago than there is today. But it just so happens that we sit here in Kazakhstan. You could say the same thing in Iran, Iraq. This bit in the middle of Asia, the middle of the continents of Europe, Asia, and Africa, where everything always has happened. And that has been the same thousands of years ago. It was the same 1,000 years ago. It's the same even actually 100 years ago. If you understand and look at the story of even the First and Second World Wars, we see history where what was happening in Iran, in Central Asia, and the steppes has been hugely important, even to things that we don't ever connect. It's just the way that we look at the past is always from the same perspective. And I think that in a world where we read about globalization, where we recognize how much more connected we are, seeing and studying those connections in the past and the present seems to me a very, not just a useful thing to do, but it seems to me essential to see how we've exchanged and how we've learned from each other and borrowed, and how we're connected.
But why this very important, according to you, region, very important in the history and just 100 years ago, why it's not very influential region when we are talking about global issues, when we are talking about global economy, when we are talking about global politics?
You mean today?
Yeah.
Well, unless I'm mistaken, the only things that I can see that really matter, that are going on in the world today, all are taking place across what are called the Silk Road countries, right? So that includes from Syria with state failure in Iraq, the rise of Taliban and Al-Qaeda forces and Islamic extremism across the whole region, not just in Iraq where we read about it, in Syria where we see it in the press, but also in Afghanistan and increasingly in places like Tajikistan and in Turkmenistan, where there are proper problems at the border points. We see a question of Iran and its position in the family of countries, dealing with its very complicated relationship with Saudi Arabia. We see in the last week Qatar being isolated, it's not just diplomatically, but physically isolated from the rest of the Gulf. We see India and Pakistan and their evolutions in different directions, both defined against each other, and then China. Everything that's happening in the world that is important and is of interest is happening in that central space between the Mediterranean and the Pacific coast of China. And in the grand scheme of things, I've come from London yesterday, Brexit is genuinely meaningless in this world where 4.5 billion people live. What happens with Brexit has some footnote in how Kazakhstan will develop. But
we here in Kazakhstan know more about Brexit than we know about, this Indian-Pakistan relations or something.
Yes.
Why?
But I understand that. That's partly because the winners write history, and Western Europe and the West for the last 300 or 400 years has been the dominant global geography and the global dominant culture. 100 years ago, during the First World War, even Belgium, which is smaller than the smallest province in Kazakhstan, Belgium had an empire in the Congo, which was an enormous entity. And because the West has had this history for which it should be very proud, and there are obviously dark spots in Western history as well that need to be calibrated, but Western Europe and the West has set the agenda for what is important. That's where the great artists, the great musicians, the great scholars have come from, but that's no guarantee that it will continue to be like that in the future. So, of course, we look back in that way, in the same way that you look back at a grand palace that was once inhabited by a family that was important. Of course, you visit these places for museums, but that doesn't mean that the future lies there too. And I think we have a big problem with this in Europe right now, of understanding what is our place in the cosmos, what is our place in the global community, where seats on the Security Council, established global economies, are being put under pressure by change in the rest of the world. And one of the stories about Brexit was its connection to globalization, which ultimately means the reaction to the fact that places like China have been growing very substantially at our expense, perceived or otherwise. The things that Trump talked about during his election campaign, saying the Chinese are ripping us left, right, and center, and we will put a stop to Chinese economic growth. Or, which Trump, by the way, says about Germany as well, that we're going to stop buying German cars because when he visited Europe a couple of weeks ago. There's a real anxiety in Europe and in the West about how to manage this process of change. And there are some voices, some very influential voices in the United States, who are talking in terms of dealing with China or managing the process of China through some form of intervention, perhaps potentially military, potentially economic, potentially cultural, which seems to me a very dangerous thing to do, because as a historian, you can't stand in the way like King Canute famously put his chair in the ocean to show that he couldn't control the water. When the wave is coming towards you, there's nothing you can do about that. And but the language of trying to block and change globalization seems to me something which is wishful thinking and will do a great deal of damage if tariffs go up, because it protects inefficient businesses and it moves the West, in fact, in the opposite direction to places like Kazakhstan, where here you're trying to privatize your businesses, you're trying to have lower state involvement in the running of the economy, you're trying to bring in the best business investment, the best scholars, the best people to come and advise, and other parts of the world are going in the opposite direction of trying to put up walls. In fact, symbolically as well as literally, these discussion about how we can build a wall across, how the Americans could build a wall across with Mexico, how we can fortify the borders of Hungary to put up barbed wire to stop movement of people. So, we are struggling with these questions too in the West.
How this part of the world, I mean Asia in general, or maybe Central Asia, will change in the future? How you see this picture?
Well, there are lots of different, that's a very good question. There are lots of different ways to answer it. There are lots of different megatrends that I and I'm sure many people here try and keep an eye on. One is about the growth of the megacity and urbanization. And in China, the speed and the scale of urbanization is unprecedented in human history. The number of people who have moved from the countryside into the city. And of course, that poses lots of challenges, environmental, what kind of pollution, what kind of damage gets done. It poses questions in very basic things like food and water supply, energy use, where the Chinese energy consumption is projected to treble before 2030. And that provides all sorts of dynamics for change, sometimes which produce, like my friend Nassim Taleb, the black swan. It's the unexpected events that happen, the things that no one is waiting for, that we see will be influential. But the way in which people live, the way in which they travel, the transmission of diseases. But Asia has a population more or less of 4.5 billion people, and how the people of this continent deal with each other, whether it's through organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, whether it's through Eurasian unions of one kind or another, or through Belt and Road initiatives. It seems to me that this is a world that is growing and waking up to these kind of possibilities and trying to find ways to plan for that future. And that seems to me both very sensible, but as a historian, I would assume that some of these initiatives will work much better than others, and in some cases, parts of initiatives will work better in some places than others. So there will be some unevenness of development, but control of resources, access to food, water, ability to control the environment, ability to provide energy, and so on, plus pressures of politics of large urban populations, which we know, the Russian Revolution ultimately trace its trigger back to Central Asia, and this is where the first problems appeared were in Tashkent in 1916, before they telegraphed through to Petrograd. Central Asia is a very sensitive barometer of change that can be happening many thousands of miles away, because this is the natural global crossroads, and it always has been.
And let's go to China and talk a bit about this country. Here we know a lot about their new program, New Silk Road, as we can say. What do you think about this program? Is it something that will change the world and cooperation between countries at the West, in the East, at the East, or will change role of this region and role of the China? Or it's something just, political that will not work?
Yes, well, you in Kazakhstan have had a very particular experience these last 27 years or so, or 25 years, since the fall of the Soviet Union, because you here have lived through a change that happened fast, as fast and as dramatic as any that's ever happened in this part of the world, any country actually. The switch from the kinds of buildings we can see in Astana that arose up. It's not even 20 years old yet, Astana, more or less 20 years old. So you're familiar here of what sudden, rapid change can do. You're familiar with the benefits that brings and the kinds of issues and problems and hurdles that it presents as well, right? But I think there's no question that the scale of what it is that China is not just proposing to do, but is actually doing, has the ability to transform the lives for not for millions or for even tens of millions or hundreds of millions. It has the potential to change the life of billions of people. So, just as one particular example, one of the strands of the Belt and Road Initiative is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, where the population of Pakistan roughly is about 200 million people. The general assumption is that a successful series of investments that are proposed may raise the GDP of Pakistan by 3 to 7%. And that's a scale that is almost incalculable in terms of its impact it will have on the education of children, of women, access to clean water, transportation links, ability for people to have reliable energy sources that allow their lights to work at night, allow digital connections that either don't exist or are unreliable. And the process of poverty alleviation, of changes to gender roles, of hierarchies and so on, it's on a biblical scale. The question is whether the Belt and Road Initiative will play out smoothly. There are lots of challenges to big investment, and everybody will know that it's being offered large amounts of money never come exactly for free, right? This isn't an aid project. Being able to pay your obligations is important, and one of the challenges will be what happens when 1, 2, 3 or more of these massive projects run into financial difficulty. What kind of partner will the Chinese be? And that's the question that, because of the banking crisis that happened all over the world 10 years ago, we have some experience of, because a bank has an opportunity to restructure or to take some of the pain along with the customers, or to inflict punishment when somebody defaults. And that process of learning who you're dealing with, it's like any kind of relationship. It's like a marriage. You realize when you have a difficult period, how well equipped are you to solve the problem? Are you both equally incentivized to problem? And I think we don't yet know, because it's still so new, how asymmetric the resolution will be.
And what kind of marriage it will be between China and other countries like Kazakhstan and other countries in Central Asia?
Correct, and there's, of course, that's on the high level, but then there are individual commercial relationships between individual Chinese entities that may or may not have closer links to the Chinese government, and then their investments here, and then how are these resolved? Are they resolved through the AIFC here that's being set up in Astana? How smoothly will that run? And having justice that's delivered in this kind of way through English common law, it gives me comfort to know that there will be independent. But if you and I have a dispute, the fact that somebody independent resolves it doesn't make you happy if you lose, right? So I think that it's about trying to future scope and proof how to build those kinds of resolutions, particularly where there's so much at stake. And we're in part of the world where pride and and how we see ourselves is hugely important. People are proud people here in Kazakhstan, rightly so, as in China and so on. And because there is a real sense that this is a world that is moving in everybody else's favor, holding your position and being proud is something that can, while I understand it, can also be a weakness as well in the negotiating position. But I think that so much has happened in the last 4 years. It's quite hard to see what happens in the future. And as a historian, I suppose it's a very boring thing to say, but again, with Nassim Taleb, he would agree with me if he was sitting here. It can take one completely random event somewhere else in the world that can derail this process. So, although I spend a lot of time looking at, for example, there've been, kidnapping of Chinese workers in Pakistan, and which is hugely damaging. These kind of unstable processes. 100 years ago, the reason why there was a world war that dragged in from India to Australia, Germany, Russia, so on, the Russian Revolution triggered as a result, was because an Austrian man was shot in Sarajevo. And then the world descended into warfare. So, we are in we live in a super fragile world where it doesn't take much to derail plans, and what happens in North Korea, what happens in Washington, what happens in Tehran, what happens in Qatar, can have these very strange and unexpected consequences, even for these massive investment projects of Belt and Road. So I think the thing to do is to make plans, but always be ready to adapt. And again, here in Kazakhstan, because it's been a tougher 2 or 3 years than probably you were expecting 5 or 10 years ago, that has produced a reality about how hard it is to do well. That people never write fantastic books or build great companies by chance. It's the hard work that goes on behind the scenes, and having the structure that supports that is crucial to enable future growth.
Спасибо большое нашему спикеру. Я со своей стороны тоже могу порекомендовать, если вы найдете на русском языке эту книгу прекрасную, которую Питер написал, обязательно ее прочитать, или на английском, это проще. Большое спасибо. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Really nice.